I'd like to introduce to you my very good friend and our next presenter, Anne-Marie Zanzal. So, Anne-Marie Zanzal is a graduate of Yale Divinity School. She is ordained by the United Church of Christ and has served as a chaplain in hospitals and hospices, as well as pastored several churches. She is a compassionate bereavement provider certified by the MISS Foundation. She is now the CEO of Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA Plus Coaching. Her podcast, Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA Coaching Plus Coaching, her stories is available on Apple and Spotify. I think you guys understood what I was trying to say. She is the author of the memoir Authentic Peace, which will be coming out by Inara Publishing. And you can find her work at www.annemariezanzal.com and follow her on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and LinkedIn. With that said, you have the floor.
Good morning, Darren. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present something that is near and dear to my heart. I appreciated what Darren said in the beginning. I am the anecdotal. I am somebody who came out later in life, and I now work with the later in life community. So I would like to share some of the work that I have done and talk about the people that I serve within this community. So I am a coming out coach. I became a coming out coach and an LGBTQIA coach after my own coming out experience later in life. This is me. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So, this is my wife, Tonda McKay. She's a photographer in Nashville, Tennessee. Up in the corner is my 4 kids. And as Darren says, I'm the author of Authentic Peace. But the majority of my work is done with women who are in the process of coming out later in life. I serve both cisgender and trans women and non-binary folks who feel comfortable in those spaces. In the corner is a small conference I had here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm not quite sure, but it was like we all say, before the pandemic. So I'd like to share my story with you. I am somebody, as we get into this presentation, I am somebody that always sort of knew that I was not straight, but I did not have the language due to my upbringing in the conservative Catholic Church to be able to even begin to understand that. I first noticed my attraction to women when I was like 19, but I sort of chalked it up and dismissed it. I think because of my upbringing, I learned to dismiss a lot of my feelings. And so, there's a joke in the queer community that all straight girls are 3 drinks away from a lesbian encounter, and so I just chalked it up to being slightly tipsy in a bar when I was 19. The next time was when I was about 22, 23. I was engaged to be married, and my friend who actually was studying at Stanford at the time, she got her PhD there. Her and her husband, her future husband, were very involved in the queer community, and we had a wonderful conversation. And I noticed my attraction to her, and it was the first time that I ever, really said, maybe I'm gay. And what happened is I was like, where do I go? I was about, as I said, 23 years old. I was in Connecticut, not too far from New York City, but I didn't know how to find community. And it was also the middle of the AIDS epidemic. That has had a profound impact on a lot of people because at that time they were young. It was the 80s. It was the time to explore all that. But for those of us who remember, it was also a very homophobic time. So the people that were being infected by HIV were vilified, and it was absolutely horrible. And so even if you're not a man, it's still the zeitgeist, the culture was very homophobic at that time. um, so I was a good Catholic girl. So I went and I got married. I found a man that would keep me warm and safe and dry, and he absolutely did. We were married for 27 years, and I uh, really did not think about my sexuality at all for about the time I was raising children. I had 3 kids under 5, and then I had a fourth 7 years later, and so I didn't really think about my sexuality at all. It just wasn't on my radar. I was busy. I was running my life. I was raising children, and then in 2006, I read an article in Oprah Winfrey magazine that talked about the fluidity of women's sexuality. And all of a sudden, I had language to describe what I was feeling. And I told my then 16-year-old daughter, hey, if dad and I don't make it in the long run, don't be surprised if I end up with a woman. So at that point, it entered into my consciousness again. Now, I wish could say that I came out at that point, but I didn't. I was a late bloomer in everything. I had to sort of recover from my childhood, so I was pretty much a late bloomer. And at that point, the paths diverged, and I ended up going to seminary. I went to Yale Divinity School when I was 42 years old, after being in the evangelical church. Believe it or not, the evangelical church was the one that I went to is called Covenant, the Covenant Evangelical Church, and it's out of Chicago. It's from Lutheranism, the Swedish church. It's an offshoot, and it was actually, they had women ministers, and they had married ministers, and so that was like a revelation to me. And now I realize, like, I just went from one place, like, into the, what is it they say, from the frying pan into the fire. So I started to pursue ordination within that church, and what it was really interesting to me as I began that process, I realized that I belonged to the most liberal evangelical church in the in the nation. I find that evangelical churches, and I don't know, that they go, as we go west, they get more conservative. On the East Coast, I don't know, but they, my little church, why they were considered, why I consider them the most liberal, is that we had gay members, but most importantly, we had gay members in leadership. But when I went outside my little church, and was in this little denomination, and I started to see things that I really didn't like, and I started to see things that I really didn't, it just wasn't a good fit for me. There was a lot of what I call bro pastors, and I'm not. And so, after being in this ordination process with the Covenant Church, I submitted my ordination paper, and they said I wasn't covenant enough. And thank God they did, because I wasn't covenant enough. The treatment of women ministers were really poor in that church system. And also, as a pastor, I would have had to sign something that said that I couldn't marry gay people. And I was like, nope, not going to do that. And so, and you couldn't even like go and do a blessing or anything. And I'm like, no, I can't do that. So in 2009, I ended up going to Yale Divinity School. All of this is sort of concurrent. And I was such a good ally, and they were having a coming out day ceremony, and I like went to the coming out day ceremony, because I was in my 40s. Most of my fellow students were in their 20s, in their 30s, and I had an experience of suddenly realizing that I had to come out. Um, I didn't know how to do that. I really didn't. I sought professional help from therapists, and I also spent a whole year. I did something called clinical pastoral education, which is how people become chaplains. And I did a residency in a hospital for a year, and I spent the whole year questioning my sexuality. My CPE supervisor, which is like a therapeutic supervisor of the other chaplains, she's a lesbian, and my other member in my cohort was a lesbian. So I feel like the universe was surrounding me with my people and saying, "Hey, look, you're not straight." So um, after that, after about a year, at the end of that year, I met a woman minister who lost everything when she came out, and I said, I can't do this. I just can't. I can't. And so I went back into the closet. um, and then I also started to pursue ordination in the United Church of Christ, which I knew was a much more liberal and progressive denomination here in the United States. And I ended up becoming a minister through the UCC. The whole time, though, my ex-husband and I were really struggling in our marriage, and there was a lot more than our. It was so much more than my sexuality, but we were struggling in our marriage, and in therapy, we were in marriage therapy, and I told our therapist, who, by the way, was another lesbian, which she just, I mean, it just the universe. That's the way things happen, and she ignored it, believe it or not. She said, "Well, it's probably because of the difficult relationship you had with your mother," which a lot of the later in life lesbians hear. And I'm going to insert an eye roll here, which you probably can't see. So, believe it or not, in 2016, when I was ordained, um, 3 weeks later, after my ordination, I came out. Now, I believe it's because all of a sudden, all the things that I had had on my brain for the previous 10 years had cleared. I had achieved a goal, and I began the process of coming out. But what I did different this time was I found community. It is vitally important for queer people to find community when they come out. And I Googled late in life lesbian, and I found a group of women who were in the process of coming out. Uh, and all of a sudden, I had community of people that were talking about the same things I had always thought about. And all of a sudden, I heard my story again and again and again. And oftentimes, I believe that we often hear in the telling of another story, we often hear our own. So that's why I believe it's so vital for us to tell stories about how things happen. So I Googled that. I found my community. At the time, this secret, private, you couldn't find it unless you knew somebody Facebook group. Um, had 160 members. By the time the person shut it down, it had 2,400 members. Um, and things changed for me. All of a sudden, I found a community. I found the strength and I found the courage to come out. And it began my journey of leaving my ex husband, coming out, um, and finally finding that piece of myself that had been lost for such a long time. So I'm going to share my screen with you and tell you the rest of my story and the story of the woman I work with. So when we call it, there's lots of groups online that calls it late bloomers. And, it is a very subjective thing for people who'd consider themselves late in life. Typically, I have noticed after working with this community for the last 4 years. So, what happened is that I started to be knocking around in these communities, and I noticed this overwhelming sense of grief and loss and disconnection. And I was a grief counselor. And so, about 4 years, I started to do mutual support groups for women who were in the process of coming out later in life. I, excuse me, all the groups at first started to be, focused on the grief work I did. But as time went on, I started to realize there were many complex reasons why people waited so long to come out. What I have observed, now these are all of my observations of somebody who works in the field, and that's why I'm so aligned with Darren that we need to have some real vital research about this. And I'm not a researcher, I'm a caretaker. So I'm at the other end of it. So what I have noticed is people have a catalytic event. So either the catalyst can be somebody that they meet that all of a sudden they start to fall in love with, and that all of a sudden they start to question their sexuality or they start to become curious about their sexuality. Um, the catalysts, now the people that sometimes people who find a catalyst sort of can be aware of their sexuality, can be aware of their questioning, or it can come out of the absolute blue. They never thought they were gay, they never knew that it could be a possibility for them. And so a lot of times, this is such a shock to their system, they can't even believe it. Also, too, what often happens is people have what was called I call a catalytic event. So a lot of people have something happen. They are, they get sick, they have a divorce, a parent dies, which is often really, really something. Like I look back at my own journey, and the first time that I really thought about being gay was right after my father died. And then the next time, ironically, was when my mother died, but this is all in reflection. And so for me, my catalytic event was my ordination. It was because I believe that, now my minister friends say it's because God ordains the whole person, and that, that was a piece of me that needed to be exposed or acknowledged. But then there's my real side of my brain, the more logical side of my brain, which I have already said is that, finally everything was cleared out of the way for me to really, really consider my sexuality for the first time. So later in life is subjective. So I know all of you think that everybody that's later in life is 40 years old or 50 years old. No. I have clients as young as 25. They feel like they're later in life because their generation, a lot of their friends came out as teenagers, and they feel like they're later in life. Believe it or not, my oldest clients are 74, 75 plus. They're somebody that are coming into the reality of their sexuality very, very late in life. What I love about my 70-year-old plus clients is that they move faster through this process than anybody else. They go from realization to being in love within 6 months, oftentimes. It is, I think it's because they don't have time, and they can't, as I say, they can't mess around. So I find that my later in life people that are in their late 60s, early 70s really embrace this process and go through it very quickly. I find that the majority of the women I work with come from a very chaotic childhood. And they often identify as people pleasers, caregivers, or perfectionists. I'm going to be, you'll see some very informal study I did that most come from a conservative religious background. And that's myself. I came from a very conservative religious background where sex was bad. My mother was a lot older when she had me, so I had a Depression era mom. She was like in her 40s when she had me, so she was incredibly conservative and she was able to recite the Baltimore Catechism to me. And so sex outside of marriage was bad. So when I started having sex outside of marriage, when I was about 19, 20, I it wasn't really good, but I thought I was aware enough to know that I might be guilty. So I thought, well, it's because I'm guilty. It's because because I shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. And so it never occurred to me that I was sleeping with the wrong gender for my sexual orientation. And I got a lot of us get married because of family or societal pressure. A lot of women are they often build families with men that I almost joke that we have a typical man that we marry is somebody who is emotionally unavailable and considered a good guy. And oftentimes, when people get on the Facebook groups, the first thing they say is, I'm married to a good guy. And then sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Um, so, what happens to people when they come out later in life? So, as I said, it's 25 to 75. The majority of the people I work with are 35 to 55. I was 52 when I was come out, and I was married for 27 years. The biggest thing is the loss of identity. Like, I lost who I was. I was the married mother of four, you know, over what is Garrison Keller says, overachieving kids, or I can't remember the quote, but it's a great quote. Um, and what ends up happening is that it's very, very painful and difficult. The majority of the women I work with are married. The ones that are single often have been career focused, and they just thought that romance wasn't for them. They tried dating men, just didn't work, but they never got married. So you lose your identity, and oftentimes you lose your marriage. Um, Most times, people in the beginning try to figure out a way to make the marriage work. So, oftentimes, couples talk about opening their marriage, or becoming polyamorous. In my observation, I find that that's just a stopgap measure and putting a band-aid on something. I find that people that are monogamous in the beginning of their marriage is very hard to go to an open marriage or to polyamory. Um, a lot of times, the men in the relationship, there's also a bargaining that goes on, and so they say, "Oh, you can have a girlfriend. That's okay with me." And inherently, that's very patriarchal, because a man would never tell his wife to go have a boyfriend and explore. And I think that's truly because women are valued less in our society. But the thing is if you tell your wife who is bisexual or lesbian to go and explore, and she falls in love with another woman, chances are you will get divorced. Um, Divorce is painful and hard in this society, and it's one of the things that um, is not acknowledged about how much grief is involved in divorce. Uh, that Even if you're the one that initiates the divorce, and by the way, 80 to 90% of all divorces are initiated by a woman. And it's 90% if the woman is college educated. Um, and so the divorce is incredibly painful. It's a loss of identity, and spouses go all the way from, hey, we've had a good life, let's just break up the family, break up our resources, and that's it, to men that try to take away children and things like that. So the spectrum is very broad in the divorce. My ex-husband, who I had a wonderful friendship with when we were married, couldn't handle. He really wanted to penalize me with finances and stuff like that. Relationships with children often change. I'll be really honest. When people have young children under 8 or 9, unless the kids have been raised in a homophobic environment, little kids don't care. They just want to know that they're going to be loved. So the little children really do accept their parents' sexuality. Like it is like, you know, hey, mom might be dating women at some point, and the little kids are like, okay, it's just not a problem for them. I find that kids that are 12 plus really struggle with both the divorce and the, let me rephrase that. They can struggle with the divorce and their parents coming out. Um, the role in the family unit changes a lot, and so it is all like it's one of those things where yes, it's about coming out, but also it's about divorcing and ending a long term marriage. And so a lot of times my clients come to see me in the beginning and it's about them being gay, but then the majority of my work is about divorcing, because a good mother doesn't get divorced. A good mother doesn't put her needs before her family's needs. There is still a lot of like divorce harms children, and it doesn't. I have found it doesn't, as long as both parents are very respectful and are looking for the best needs of the children. And if the child is struggling, that they get their own person to talk to. Um, Oftentimes there's change in work life. Sometimes people come out and work, sometimes people don't. Um, I am a firm believer you have to make a living, so we have to choose carefully if we come out. I came out at work very slowly. I was a chaplain. I was the face of the hospice. I did all the public events, everything. And when I came out, the very conservative, she was very conservatively Catholic, the director of the hospice no longer used me as the public face. Oftentimes you lose community. I came out in a very liberal town in Connecticut, voted Democrat in all the recent elections. And what wasn't liberal was their heteronormative thinking. And so what I found is that when you divorce in a heteronormative community such as that, and I have found this with all my women, that there is a lot of judgment, and people who are married, who are your married friends, often pull away. My married friends did pull away, and I think it's two reasons. I think it's because people are afraid. They say, oh, this, I had standing within my community. And as a married woman with 4 beautiful children and a nice husband that everybody loved, and when I got divorced, I lost my standing. And I think it's because people are afraid, hey, if Anne Marie and Jim can get divorced, then that can happen to me. Or there's somebody that are also struggling with their sexuality and it was too close to home for them. So people pulled away, and I did lose friendships. Parents and family often pull away. I was very lucky. I did not have to come out to my parents because they were gone, but I have a sense that if I did, my father would not have approved because of previous things that had happened in my life. Um, and also too, a lot of times people just, it's so painful that people just move. I moved from Connecticut to live with my now wife in Nashville, Tennessee, 4 years ago, April 4th. And I just needed to get out of there. And ironically for me, because I was a member of a very liberal, progressive church, my coming out in my church community was a non-event. I mean, I didn't get a lot of pushback. I was also the pastor, associate pastor of that church. So I'm not quite sure why, but they were actually pretty good. Um, so also people's relationship with God. Those people who still believe in God, most of the women come from conservative faith backgrounds, so they believe that God hates them. They believe that they cannot have a relationship with God anymore because they are gay. And so a lot of them really, I should have said, relationship with their religious institution, because um, I have women that are from the Islamic and Orthodox faiths, Jewish faiths. I'm going to change that slide. They often either leave their their faith home, or they get censored. They get asked to leave. They get their membership gets rescinded. A lot of times, there's a lot of regret when people come out of later in life, regret about staying in the marriage, regret about um, having not having the experiences of somebody who's gay as a young person. I In a piece I wrote for What's Your Grief, I said that I had regret of the life I didn't have as a lesbian woman, and I had grief over the future that I had planned for myself, because all of a sudden my future was gone. And so there is a lot of grief when people come out later in life. On the other hand, there's a lot of joy around discovering who you are. A lot of times um, having a relationship with somebody that meets all your emotional and sexual needs. It is a profound experience of awakening and self awareness as we become more comfortable within our sexuality. Uh, but like I said before, there is just all this disconnection, right? Family, friends, faith, community. So all of a sudden, everything that we've been connected to previously is falls apart, and people feel incredibly disconnected. Community works, so that's one of the reasons why I started to create communities for people, because they needed a place to find home, to call home during this transition as they reformulate and rechange their lives. Um, and another thing that I've really noticed is the sense of cognitive dissonance. And I'm going to read this. Sometimes people hold a core belief which is very strong, and when they are presented with the evidence that works against the belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny everything that doesn't fit with the core belief. And that's what happens. It is so very painful when people come out later in life, because they have to reorder often everything they have believed about being a woman, about being straight, about being a mother, and also a lot of times they have been presented with evidence again and again and again that they're not straight. That's me. I was presented with evidence again and again and again that I was not straight. But my brain had been told from the beginning that I was, and that it was sinful if I wasn't. So my brain had, it took it a while. It's been 6 years now, and it has taken me it took a good 3 or 4 years for my brain to be able to say, yeah, you're gay. And it's like the feelings of being a straight person have really receded into my past life. So I did a little very informal. So I have a couple of Facebook groups on that are secret, and that are for people who are. I work with just cisgender and trans women and non-binary folks that feel comfortable in those spaces. Um, and I did a very informal poll in my Facebook group, and this group has right now about 11. This one has 1,149 people, and I asked some very basic questions. And so this is the responders. I got 228 responders, and 137 of them came from conservative faith traditions. I listed several of them. I find that the majority of people that I work with from conservative faith traditions come from the Orthodox Jewish faith, Roman Catholicism, Southern Baptist, Pentecostal, Church of Christ, and then all the other little more smaller traditions. 29 came from progressive faith traditions. 41 consider themselves not to be raised religiously. 11 had primary caregivers who were raised religiously. And what I want to say is that, so if somebody wasn't raised religiously, but their parents were, those seeds are still there. The seeds of sometimes homophobia, the seeds of how roles of women in society are still there. So it still impacts people even though they have not been raised in a religious tradition, especially if mom and dad were raised in a conservative tradition. I have several women that were raised in religious cults, often Christian religious cults. Uh, how do you define a cult? I'm not sure, but I don't want to go there. But they've defined it as a cult. And some people were not raised in a faith tradition, but did join one as an adult. So I took this from the GCRR website, and there is a bunch of stuff that what religious trauma can look like. And man, does this describe the women I work with. And as I have been on this journey, I realize that it's me too. And so I'm not sure where I fall on my belief. I am sure where I fall on what I believe in existentially, but I know that I cannot be a part of the church anymore just because of the pain that the church has caused. So, first of all, this is women. And I think all women who have been raised in conservative churches have these experiences. And second, these are queer women. So we're going from, there's several things going on. As I said, as I started to work with this community, a lot of them have deep shame and deep guilt around having needs that don't fit the typical pattern in a heteronormative society or a compulsory heterosexual society. Um, they have intense fear or rejection by God or their faith community, um, feelings of unworthiness, lack of self compassion, feelings that they can't trust themselves, their body, or their, I'm sorry, my thing is, or their emotions. Um, and that's true. A lot of the women I work with um, struggle to believe this about themselves, that they're gay. They just really, really struggle. And I find that there's a lot of back and forth and back and forth. There is superstitious beliefs. There is, I found that there's perfectionism. Oh, so terrified of making a mistake. What if I get divorced and I'm wrong? What if I think I'm gay and I have an experience and I find out I'm wrong? Um, they have, we have extreme dualistic thinking. Every individual. So as we go through each one of these, it truly is part of, I think, first being a woman, and second being someone who is not straight. And as you can see at the bottom of this is denying sexuality, and I do believe that is part of the religious trauma that the women I work with experience. So as I have been saying, I believe that there's a lot of trauma layers for the later in life LGBTQIA plus community. So first, existing as a woman in a patriarchal, misogynistic society, which all women have to deal with. Religious trauma from personal or parental experiences. Religious trauma for being a woman in a conservative religious, religious trauma for being LGBTQIA plus, because your very personhood is considered sinful in a lot of the a lot of the conservative churches, and um, it's even like if you think about it, saying "I love the sinner but hate the sin." There, that's so problematic on so many levels. And so they really, people who are queer really struggle with the notion of being sinful. And those who have a real spiritual bent and a spiritual side want to be part of sometimes of a church community, and but they don't realize that 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 they can still be gay and still call themselves whatever faith tradition they want to. And so, because they've been told for so long that if you're gay, you're not a Christian. And so, there's a real struggle there for a lot of people. And then, uh, and then on the next level is that a lot of the women that I work with grew up in some sort of family chaos and or abuse. A lot come from alcoholic homes. A lot of them have experienced emotional abuse. A lot of them have experienced sexual abuse. And of course, as we're talking about here, a lot of them have experienced spiritual abuse. Um, so I've asked some questions, and the first question that I asked was, what was the hardest thing to do when you came out regarding your religious beliefs? This was questions I asked in my Facebook group, and I got about 10 responders. Uh, Basically, was to leave their church. Um, I had to deconstruct beliefs prevented me from accepting myself. She was told she was a pervert, confused, living in sin, and choosing to live a life of persecution for myself and family, and also that this sin separated me from God. You know, it was so funny. Not funny, but it was so interesting because in the beginning, I started to try to work within the framework of the church to work with the women. I work with, and saying Jesus loves you doesn't work. you know, because there's such deep held core beliefs that they are sinful. And also, I really want to mention too is something I have forgotten to say, that it's perfectly appropriate. As I said, the majority of the women I work with are 35 to 55, to be in midlife and to begin to question things. So, developmentally, it is very appropriate for the women I work with, to be questioning everything, because midlife is where we start to question what we've told to be and often become who we were created to be. So a lot of them, as you can see, there's a lot more comments as we go on. I'm not going to kill you and read them all out to you. This is my good friend April. She was raised Independent Baptist, and I find she is a hero to me. I'm sorry, this is another person, and she came out as from the Jehovah Witnesses. She is also somebody who considers the Jehovah Witness a cult. I asked the question. I asked the question, how did your community of faith treat you? Mostly people didn't tell their faith community. If they did, sometimes they were shunned. Sometimes they were, told, they still love me, but didn't love my sin. Um, they they often have been oftentimes, especially people in ministry, feel incredibly used, because a lot of times their community just turns their back on them, and they get shunned and often lose, pensions and all kinds of things. Um, but a lot of times, I love this quote here. This is the one I wanted to mention. This is my friend April, and she's the one who was the Independent Baptist. And she said, there was an attempt to enact church discipline for my moral sin of choosing to be gay. I refused to allow them to publicly shame me, so they excommunicated me without being in attendance. And since I was a teacher in the church-based school, I lost my job. And she was flooded with text messages, and horror stories of divorce were included. Since she still has to attend the school's function because her ex-husband is within the church school, so she dealt with all of this stuff. I want to add a caveat to story of April's story, because she has had so many people that were her students beforehand reach out to her since then and say that, you were my hero. You did something that I wanted to do. So sharing and showing our stories and being an example for other people within conservative communities often gives people hope. The next question I asked is, did you reframe your understanding of God, or do you no longer believe in God and higher power? It's very mixed. Some people still have beliefs in God. Some people consider themselves agnostic. Some people consider themselves atheist. I am an agnostic. I really realized when I couldn't work with the church anymore, when I was on a Zoom. I'm just finishing my last church right now. I'm a couple weeks away. And we were talking about their concept of God, to write a psalm. And I realized that everybody's concept of God was very, 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 very different than mine. And I don't particularly believe in a deity. And so it was like a real wake-up call for me that I just couldn't be a leader in this type of situation anymore. I love my friend Beth writes, I joke that I'm 99 atheist with a 1% agnostic part. And so what people have to do is they continually have to refrain God. And the women I work with are so incredibly smart and really think about these issues deeply. And so I asked the question, are you still a member of a faith community? And every single person responded no. Um, and I think that's because of several reasons. I think it's because they no longer want to be a part of a system that abused them, or they think that they can't because they're sinful and that they are wrong and their personhood is wrong. So, and that breaks my heart when I hear people believe that um, they are cast out by what they believe in. So, I'm not sure who is listening, and I hope it's a lot of the therapists. And I asked, so I've worked with this community now for 4 years. I'm going to say that the therapeutic community, by and large, fails the queer community very badly. And if people come out later in life, often their questions about their sexuality are dismissed. They are said they are phased. They are told they are confused. And like when I came out to my lesbian therapist, I told it was because of other things. So I think there's a real misunderstanding around sexuality, a real misunderstanding around when people can claim their sexuality. So, if you are a therapist or a caregiver, the grief is overwhelming. I have a lot of resources on my website regarding grief, and to provide presence in their grief and understand how grief and really learn how grief can affect us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Empathy is always very welcome, and even if you haven't had this experience, to be able to provide presence to people who've had and to just listen, because it is very painful to lose your privilege as a married straight person in this society, because I went from I was actually at the pinnacle as a woman that I could be in this society. I was married, long-term marriage, kids, career, wealth, and I was so unhappy, and I had something missing, and I call it my missing piece. And it wasn't not so missing, it was actually on a shelf in my closet, and it was my queerness. But that's why I called my book Authentic Peace, because it's play on the word peace. And I don't have a missing piece anymore. Um, in the early days of coming out, people often have very real physical symptoms that can be debilitating. I could not sleep, and I lost 20 pounds when I came out. I found that a lot of times people um, are just in such shock about everything that's going on around them. They are either not able to sleep or sleep too much. But what I realize, it's basically this classic symptoms of grief and the grief of loss. So people are grieving so many things, like I had said in the slide a while ago. So if someone comes out to you and they're later in life, don't ask questions about their spouse or children. Just be welcoming and accepting and loving. Affirm their anger at God and religion. A lot of times people have a lot of anger at both. Share your own experiences of God and provide resources for them to do their own. If you're a member of the queer community, please don't question their sexuality or gender identity. Um, it's very devastating for someone who risks something and tells somebody within the queer community that they think they might be gay, and the person says, "Oh, you can't be gay, you've been married." That's so wrong, and it's so hurtful to people who are just coming out. There's something in the later in life community we call a second adolescence, and it's really where where, where you are just very, very sexually aware, and it's because we never had a first, and it's very, very normal for people to experience a second adolescence when they come out. So many people say, excuse me, So many people say, my God, I feel like a 13-year-old boy. So, and that's a lot of surprise because also too, it's oftentimes it's the first time they've ever had those types of feelings in their life. The women that I work with run the gamut in their relationships with their ex-spouses, from not wanting to have sex with them at all to they have sex and it's fine. So it is really interesting. It runs the gamut. Um, so there are people that still want to be members of the faith community, and got something caught in my throat. I'm so sorry. And they still want to be a faith community. And so there are affirming LGBTQIA faith traditions out there. The UCC, Disciples of Christ, Reform Judaism, Universalist Unitarian, all of those faith traditions um, are they can be affirming to the LGBTQIA community. Um, Understand that there will be good and bad days. So this is often a many-year process for some late bloomers. And grief, the thing about the grief is that the grief stays for a long time. And I don't know if you all have ever seen the grief jar where there's like this ball in the grief jar. And the thing is that, so the misconception is that the ball gets smaller and smaller, but what really happens when this change happens is that we grow larger. Our life experiences grow bigger. So the grief ball stays the same size, but it doesn't have the effect it did in the beginning of all the losses. Help them find queer community. Number one thing, people need other people that have had this experience. And what I want to say too, whether you come out at 18 or 80, the experiences often follow a very, very, very similar pattern. And and if you are queer, use the we language. If somebody comes out to them, I would come out to you. You immediately start using we language. I always, when I have somebody who reaches out for me, the first time, I always use language like, oh, in our later in life community, because I want them to know that they have a community because they've lost so much. So it's really important for people to be connected with other human beings that understand this experience. So when I was first coming out, I was dating my wife, and she was talking. So, oh, by the way, my wife's been out for 40 years. She came out when she was a teenager. And she was telling me about the full embrace versus the half embrace. This is actually my daughter and I, after my ordination, I'm in my robes. And what she said is that there's that half embrace and that full embrace. So a half embrace is somebody comes out to you and you say to them, oh, nice. Oh, that's good. Thanks for telling me. How's your husband with all this stuff? How's your kids? How's your mom and dad? How's your brothers and sisters? No, this has nothing to do with them. So my first full embrace actually came from my son's youth pastor in the church, in my UCC church. She was about 30, and so I told her I was in the process of coming out. And what she said to me changed everything. She said, oh my God, Anne-Marie, I'm so excited for you. I am so excited that you figured this out, and I can't wait to see what happens. And that full embrace changed everything for me. And so after that, when I got a half embrace, I was super aware of that. Um, what needs to be done? Well, I think Darren and I might talk about that afterwards, but there needs to be research done. I'm not an academic, I'm a caregiver. There needs to be research in sexuality. One of my big questions is, and I think I've sort of figured it out, is why it takes so long for people to figure this out. We are a much bigger community than people think we are. When I moved south, first of all, I was in the north and then I moved south. And I have found in the southern community in which I live, there are so many women that get married and then they realize they're gay. So it is much more accepted down here. I find the coast can, like, especially in big city areas, can be a little tougher for the later in life community because a lot of times gay people go to the cities. So, um, and what I have found is that 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 we are a much larger community than people ever thought they are. And by the way, I haven't talked about the men at all. It's a little bit different with the men because a lot of times men often have side that they, you know, they said the down low. Men often are on the down low throughout this experience. At least that's what I've experienced from the men I've talked to and stuff like that. It is just as hard for them um, to come out later in life. They often have same losses, and but I have a friend I refer them to. There's just so much work that needs to be done in this area around sexuality and why it takes people so long and how religious trauma has affected people and made them not be able to fully embrace who they are authentically. And I feel like there's been a lot of trauma in the community. And it wasn't until I came out I realized what had happened to me.
I remember trying to tell people I'm still the same person. You just know a little bit more about me than what you knew before. The person you loved before is still the same person. You just get to know a little bit more. You get to know a little bit more of a piece of me that I found out. And so I came up with this quote when I first came out, and I still reiterate it. And it's, "Do not judge me by a part of me, for that's not the whole of me. But do not negate that part of me, for without it I am not whole." So don't forget that piece, but don't judge me by it either. Like, there's so much less. And that goes with anything in life.
So here are some resources. I have my podcast is really good if you want to understand this journey. My first season, I'm starting to expand a little bit more, but my first season is really about women coming out later in life, sharing their stories. And that was my friend April, who was an independent Baptist when she came out. So I'm done with my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. I'm so glad you all are here.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much for doing this for us and shedding a much needed light on a very hidden and concealed problem. Seems to be one of our skeletons in the closet for society.
No pun intended.
Right. But I do have some questions that I see other people wanting to ask. Challenging questions. So, and I want to be able to formulate my questions in a sensitive way, but I also want to be very direct so that my questions are understood. I guess two of them are more ethical. And the first one I think of is, you know, for me, I'm a dad and I have a little daughter. And her and I have been best buds since day one. I recognize that this is not going to be a perfect analogy by any means, but if later in life I decide or I come to learn that fatherhood just isn't for me and I'm just not comfortable with it anymore, or I'm not happy, do I not have a moral obligation to still be my daughter's dad? And does that apply in a marriage relationship? If you learn I am actually not happy in this marriage, but I have made a commitment to another human being, and I presume, the typical at the altar, I make an oath to stick it out with this human being. Is there an ethical responsibility to stick it out in that marriage and see if there's a way to work in the new part of you? New part of you. It's not the right word.
So, so I'm gonna say, Darren, when you started to talk, I could feel the anger rising in me. I'm gonna be really honest with you. What I think you're missing is that being queer is like me having blue eyes. It is something that I haven't chosen. It has been a part of me forever. I mean, just because I came out, I know you're not saying this, but just because I came out doesn't mean that I've abandoned the fact that I'm a mother. I will be a mother for the rest of my life to the 4 beautiful children that I have. I'm wondering, I would like to push back at you a little bit and say, is the oath around marriage comes from the religious tradition that you were raised in. And perhaps we need to rethink in this day and age why people get married and do we ethically have to stay in a marriage in which we are not having our emotional and sexual needs met by another person? Because I think intrinsically you are asking, oh, we should give up a piece of ourselves or a piece of who we are to stay within a relationship that not only doesn't feed us, but also teaches our children inherently to give up a piece of themselves because of an oath they made when they were 22 years old. Mm. People change. Life changes. And I'm going to say, whether I was gay or not, I shouldn't have remained married to my husband. So, but my queerness was the piece that gave, my gayness was what let me finally leave that relationship because of my religious upbringing that, and the example my parents set and his parents set, that you stay married no matter what. And I feel like as a society, we need to rethink that, rethink what marriage actually is.
So you're saying it's a bit of an outdated institution, a little bit, the way we have approached it in the past. You stick it out no matter what kind of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like, yes, absolutely. That is so outdated. And people, women especially, I mean, I think men do it as well, but for different reasons. Women especially believe they have to stick it out no matter what, and it's so harmful. And so then we end up raising another generation of codependent people and people who are people pleasers. And until we are able to be to claim who we are as people and say, hey, I'm not happy here, I'm going to leave this relationship because I'm not happy, I think we're teaching our children not to stay in places that do not fit them.
Interesting. I do appreciate that response. And it gives me a lot more to think about. Several other things kind of come up as a result of it. And I hear I hear you when you say you could feel the anger stirring up in you. And part of me kind of wants to say, good. This is an academic conference where it is my job to kind of push back and to try and help refine, but also get more clarity for these things as well. And as an ethical philosopher myself, I'm seeing these things from a different perspective, from the academic perspective. So 2 things. You did, in fact, make an oath. Whether it was something that we ought to get rid of as a society is a slightly different conversation. And I would even maybe agree with that. But the truth is, though, you did make an oath. And when you broke that oath, did this not cause trauma for your partner? And is there an ethical problem? Is there a value conflict that in leaving the marriage, you likely caused other people such pain and grief? And is that appropriate? Is that an ethical thing to do?
So, one, uh, I made an oath to marry somebody who would be emotionally available to me, and he never was. Two, people have a response. Yes, my choices made people have some difficult feelings. But three, they are responsible for their feelings, not me. We all make choices all the time that may cause people to have difficult feelings, but it is not my responsibility to have for their feelings. People are responsible for their own feelings. So I was responsible for all my feelings that I had around this. And my ex-husband, who oftentimes didn't show up in my marriage in ways that would be appropriate as a supporting spouse, a long time ago didn't keep his vow. So,
And I'm not trying to I'm not asking you to bring up all
but the thing is like, but I know. So I'm not an ethicist. So but the question, but the question is flawed because it sounds like you're asking a question that asks me to have responsibility for other people's feelings and emotions. That's not my responsibility. That's their responsibility. As a mother, my responsibility is to my children, to help them, to provide support, to be there for them, to help them. Like my youngest son went into therapy when he was 12, because he was 12 when all of this went on. And he needed somebody to talk to that was neither his father or myself. And ironically, my youngest son still has a relationship. He's 19, he's in college, and his relationship with Doug is his relationship, and he still talks to him once in a while when he's going through things. So I'm really glad that he did that. And so yeah, I'm really, that question just, like, it's sort of flawed because you're making me responsible for other people's feelings, and I'm not.
And I'm not asking that, though. Trauma happens to us externally, oftentimes without our permission.
Mm-hmm.
So the simple act of coming out later in life, and as you even put it, kind of dissolving an entire family unit,
Mm-hmm.
causes trauma for people. Is it worth that?
Absolutely. And it doesn't cause trauma for people, Darren. It causes change.
Well, sure, it causes trauma for a lot of people. I've
Well, no, Mike, it causes
It may
change.
not have caused trauma in your circumstance, but for a lot, it does cause trauma. The destruction of a family unit can be very traumatic.
But I didn't destroy my family unit. I changed my family unit. My children, one of the best things that somebody said to me is that kids can't have too many people to love them. And so it is not a destroying of a family unit, it is a changing of a family unit. We are still a family. My children and I are still a family. They now have two other adults. I mean, my kids are adults now, but they have two other adults in their lives. My ex-husband and I are both partnered, and we're both much happier now. Have you ever thought that my claiming my sexuality was a way for my ex-husband to now be with somebody who's actually straight? and and he's a straight man, and now he's with a woman that is straight. It's actually, in the end, it is better for him to be with somebody than that is straight, than for me to stay in a marriage as a queer woman where we're not having sex, not because of me, by the way, just because we didn't. And like, so how is that ethical to stay in a marriage when you're not straight?
No. And you're bringing up wonderful points. I do think that, ethically, it sounds like you're saying the ends justify the means. And so it would be fun to explore this. I have some other questions, and then we're going to open it up to the rest of the group. More related to the religious trauma, what are some of the main symptoms that you are hearing from later in life individuals who come out and it's obvious they have religious trauma? What are some of the symptoms? Nightmares? Is it depression kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's depression, is anxiety, but most of all, it's disconnection. They feel they feel cast out and unloved and unworthy. And I think the biggest symptom is shame. That inherently, because they are going against their faith community, there is a lot of shame that people have to work through. And shame is debilitating, but it's debilitating. Um, Physical symptoms, like I said, I mean, it's the symptoms of grief, because they're grieving so many things, so many losses. And so the symptoms of grief is being able to sleep, not being able to sleep, not being able to eat. What it was really interesting for me, I was in 6 months into my own process of coming out later in life, and before I even realized I was grieving. Like, I'm a grief counselor. And like, all of a sudden it hit me one day, because my emotions were all over the place. I went from happy to sad to, it was awful. It was the worst time of my life. I spent 6 months crying and laying, I call it my fetal position phase. And like, then all of a sudden I realized I was grieving the loss of so much that, as I talked about, my core values, things that I deeply valued.
What I absolutely love is in your talk, you mentioned things like perfectionism and people pleasing. We're also seeing OCD. It seems to be a fairly common trait. We have several researchers investigating these very symptoms right now. So I'm really glad you pointed that out. Everybody who's in attendance, please feel free to unmute yourself. You can even start your video if you'd like, and ask our presenter questions directly.
Okay. There's a lot of comments. I don't see a lot of, thank you for all the wonderful comments. A lot of comments.
Hasn't been any questions so far in the comments, but yeah, a lot of pushback on some of my questions, which is great. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Holliday, did you have a question? Please go for it.
Yes, thank you. I'm a counselor and focusing on LGBTQ community in my area, which is Chattanooga, Tennessee, and there is not a lot of support here in this area, as you might know. Mm-hmm. And I also am just fascinated in religious trauma connected to LGBTQ and just in general. But I'm finding I feel called to collect stories, kind of like we're doing here with GCRR. But I also find sometimes when I reach out to LGBTQ individuals that I know, they don't want to talk about it, especially later in lives. Have you had that experience? Maybe I feel like, I don't know what it is. Maybe I am not gay. Maybe that's why they don't want to talk to me. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay. So no, in my wife, she like laughs because I'm a magnet for coming out stories. And and what was really interesting to her though, and this may be something really interesting to explore, she never heard her friends coming out stories at all. I mean, she's been in the Nashville queer community for 40 years. And she like, and so when they met me, all of a sudden she heard all of these stories. Um, what I find, especially with queer people over like queer people who've been out for a long time, over 50, 40, 50, um, they don't feel safe. You know, the thing is that I was a great ally to Kelly, until I realized that I was also gay. So and thank you for the work you do, because we need queer affirming therapists. Therapists there's so much within my community. I should probably do a presentation about the horror stories that I've heard, and I've had my own horror stories too. As somebody, what I realized is that I was looking for the professional to name my sexuality, and the only person that could name my sexuality was actually me. So that was a real big learning. And what I found is that older people just don't feel comfortable sharing these stories to people that are not gay, because intrinsically, all of us understand this, how difficult this is in a very a compact heteronormative society, a heterosexist society we live in. So within the queer community, there is just a quiet understanding of the difficulty it is to come out, whether you're 18 or 75. And I just want to share a personal experience. In the beginning of all this, I was with my oldest daughter, who I call Switzerland. She does a really good job, and she was supportive of both of us, very loving, and my ex-husband, I'm saying, and she got mad at me about something, and I was like, Carly, her name's Carly. I said, you don't understand like how hard it is, and then all of a sudden it hit me. She's never gonna understand. She's a straight girl. She's never going to understand this. I mean, she can have empathy and sympathy, but she's never going to understand on a gut level. So if you want to keep doing this work, I would suggest partnering with somebody that's queer, and have them help you hear the stories. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'm trying to be cognizant of our time, so I want to get to Lori real quick. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, I just want to say thank you. Basically, you've just shared my life, I guess. And so grateful that, it's like you said, it's like I'm not alone. There's a significant part of that. But I am currently doing research in gendered sexuality and religious trauma at UAlbany. Working on a PhD in social welfare. I have a former divinity degree as well. I was ordained pastor. So the connection of these things.
Hey, sister, how are you?
Hopefully we can connect a little further. But yeah, so I guess my question, if you can speak into this, is how do I keep from re-inflicting religious trauma on myself? How do I keep from, as I do this work, how do I stay healthy? Got any suggestions? Because I find like as I'm continue to process myself, and then also people share stories with me, and then I continue to engage a little deeper, I find myself experiencing some of those the very same things. I wrote in the chat that my back completely seized up, and I know it was a physical response to what was going on. So got any suggestions?
Yeah, I actually do. So I believe in holistic stuff, and so a couple of things. I do believe that for some people, as they have gone, it's not right away on their journey, but as they start to move out of sexual life, to embrace their spiritual side. So we all have spiritual sides. So how do you feed your spirit? Like, do you go out, go out into the woods? Do you like the ocean? So, for example, for me, I've got to move near the ocean because I just need to be by water. And I'm not near, I'm in Tennessee. So I've got to move some near to the ocean. So engaging your spirit. But I talk to some of the stories I hear, Lori, are so horrendous. Sometimes I'll go for a walk. I ground myself. I do the five senses thing where you touch, smell, and you like say, okay, I see a picture, I hear a noise, and really ground myself. And when I hear a really particular trauma story, I take a shower. I, and like I like literally imagine it going down the drain, because some of this, like, sometimes people, when you become a trusted person, sometimes people will tell you stories of trauma that may have to do with religion, but also may have to do with their relationship with their spouse, or like rape from their spouse. And it's so horrific that, like, I have to get it out. And I have a therapist. Get a therapist that's queer, that understands this, so that you can share these stories. And that's my suggestions. I do all those things. I also take a walk if things are really, and I play with my puppy. Is these stories are hard, and you can absorb them, and we have to not.
Yeah, thank you. I totally hear the whole water thing. I'm from I lived a half hour from Lake Michigan all my life, but I moved to Albany to study 2 years ago, and the water's far away. So,
Yeah. Well, and like, I work kayakers, and so like I always love getting on the water, because I need to live. That's like my next goal in life, to live somewhere on the water. Thank you, Lori.
It sounds like self-care is incredibly important at
Yeah,
every single stage of this.
well, and with religious trauma, I would recommend three things. I would recommend embodiment. I would recommend community, community, community. Whether, because people who come from a religious background often have a community, right? That's their community, and then they lose it. They need to find another community, whether it's gay or it's the knitting club. They need to find a community of people. That's what I believe. That's what also heals trauma, is to find other community people who are like you, and to be in community. And that's why I create the safe communities I do online for people.
Excellent.
Mhm.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much for doing this talk for us.
Thanks, Darren.
I really appreciate you and your responses. And I want to say thank you to everybody who is attending in the audience with us. We do have another presentation coming up at the top of the hour in 30 minutes. So I hope I'll see you guys back. Anne-Marie, I'll give you the last word.
Just thank you. Thank you for letting me share my story. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your beautiful responses. And reach out to me if you have any questions around any of this. I've been doing this a while, and I would love to hear about the work that you all do. It's nice to hear that people are starting to and yes, you can join my community online. You just have to message me on Facebook. And thank you for all your work you do. I hope you go out. I hope I've inspired some people who are academics, to do this very important work around religious trauma. Thank you.